Welcome to Perspectives from HSBC. Thanks for joining us. And now, on to today's show.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining HSBC podcast series of Perspectives. Today's episode is being recorded behind the scene at the HSBC Global Investment Summit happening in Hong Kong. My name is Jing Liu, HSBC Chief China Economist. I'm very pleased to be joined by Keyu Jin, Professor of Economics at Harvard University and Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. So today we're going to talk about China's economic development and its new playbook. Hi, Keyu.
Great to be with you, Jing.
We have a lot to talk about. Nowadays, we see a lot of trading partners, in addition to US, start to complain about China is getting too competitive in its export. And some people are saying that China is exporting deflation. Apparently, especially with the US-China trade tension, some other economists start to worry about they might see more inflow of Chinese goods that could, to some extent, put some pressure on their domestic manufacturing. So what's your view on this?
I do believe that there is a structural issue at heart that needs to be solved over time for the benefit of China and for the rest of the world, and indeed to maintain China's position as a global player in the world, that the model is steered towards scaling up supply, right? The local governments are not incentivized to spend as much on social services as they are in nurturing champions, whether it's BYD or NEO or DeepSeek, although DeepSeek is not actually backed by local governments, but the
it's
idea...
not a bad plan.
Exactly. The idea is to nurture these kind of companies, but they really should be spending more on social services to give a boost in demand. And also, Chinese companies are really competitive, and it has very little to do with subsidies. If you look at majority of manufacturing, 90% of manufacturing companies, there is no overinvestment. Actually, it is responding to market forces. The 10% is in some of the new sectors.
Yeah, sure.
But in general, that's going to cause tension. The fact that China absolutely dominates so much in manufacturing is going to be a problem for other developing countries, and I think there will be a backlash until they structure that, they redress that imbalance. And how to do that? Well, I mean, the easiest way is still coming back to domestic demand, but maybe they need to have some voluntary restraints on exports as well.
That's a very interesting point you're mentioning, because we also noticed that China seems to be trying to address the issue with both the demand side and supply side. On the demand side, it's a pivot towards stimulating consumption might be one way, and it also start to talk about sector-specific measures in order to cut the capacity and, as you said, maybe restrict the export. Does the outbound direct investment also play a role?
I think outbound direct investment is very much encouraged by the rest of the world, well, with exception of countries that don't welcome Chinese money, which is, I think, is not smart, but that's the fact. If you look at around the developing world, actually in the world today, there's a massive deficit in investment, right? Aggregate investment in the world is down, especially to developing countries. And some country needs to fill that gap. I think China is very interested in doing so by not only investing, but maybe bringing some of its technology, but they really need to obviously help the local economy build its own economy on its own feet. And so I think that should continue. That's a very different set of issues from exporting goods, where developing countries could also manufacture those things as well.
Yeah, this kind of resemble what Japan did in the last century. Japan ramped up the outbound direct investment after Plaza Accord, and then as an alternative to the export. Do you think China will look into that kind of solution?
I don't see where it could be a substitute for exports, because investment abroad is obviously buying assets globally, which is good for diversification of Chinese wealth, but it has a very different implication from Chinese suppliers and Chinese companies being able to sell to the rest of the world. But one thing that we do need to keep in mind is that China is actually looking more and more like a big and rich country. So if you look at its export share of GDP, it's actually falling
Yes.
over time and converging to the US and Europe, which means that it's absorbing more of its own goods. And I think that's just a trend that it will continue. I think they just need to think about whether, I still come back to this model issue, right? Because does 80 cities in China, do 80 cities really all need to do EVs? Do they all need to do solar panels because it's a policy? So there is too much competition because there's a lot of resources devoted on one thing. So rather than doing the same thing, they should find how to do complementary things as well. So there are lots of things in the economy that can still be adjusted to address this problem.
There seems to be a lot of focus on stimulating the domestic demand, in particular on consumption side. And actually, just several days after the National People's Congress, China rolls out a very comprehensive plan on stimulating the consumption.
Yes.
So can you discuss a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think that China's model, or let me be precise, political economy model, is really brilliant at scaling up supply and quite weak at raising personal consumption and therefore demand. And that has caused a lot of not only domestic issues, but raised some international controversies as well. Consumption is the big focus now. The government is steadfast, focused on raising consumption. That was very different from, let's say, 10, 20 years ago, where the focus was much more on supply, on the firms. The whole economy was geared to subsidize supply, basically, and very weak focus on demand. Now, there's a cyclical and structural component to raising consumption that I think deserves differentiation. Cyclically, in the last few years, a lot of it was precautionary saving. It was due to low wages or low growth in real wages, and also expectations about the future. I think people's expectations about jobs in the future is not as rosy as it was before, so they want to save. And of course, the household balance sheet was also weakened by the real estate downturn. More fundamentally, it's the rural population, hundreds of millions of people who still have a lack of access to social insurance and social infrastructure. Now, if we dig a little bit deeper, it also stems from the tax structure, which I think that has to be reformed as well, a very narrow tax base, income tax base. But also the government is heavily reliant on indirect taxation like VAT. So direct taxation, which helps with redistribution, is quite weak. And then the secondary redistribution through social insurance is obviously also inadequate, given that rural consumers have, an average of 5% of an average pension of the urban household. And also the 300 million migrant workers, they have, even if with the same income as an urban worker, they spend only 1/3 of that equivalent consumption of an urban worker. So this is the focus of the current government policy.
So I want to follow up on that. Actually, this sounds like a very ambitious plan. When we look at that, there's a mention of in the future, the migrant workers and their families can tap into the basic public services, basically according to their permanent residence. In the past, we have seen China trying to push forward the household registration reform, but with limited success. So what makes it different this time?
First of all, there's a real intention that they need to stabilize the real estate problem. And there is sufficient demand if urbanization can continue and the rural population can be properly integrated into the formal economy. But also, I still think that there are challenges because local governments, they operate in their own kind of autonomous sort of way. Like any other government, they care about social stability. Maybe this is very politically incorrect to mention this, but it's kind of like the immigration issue, right? When you have lots of people coming into their jurisdiction, what do they do about local employment and jobs and stability and so forth? So I think there's some challenges, but one example is in Tianjin. They want to obviously stabilize the real estate sector. So one policy they proposed was, well, anyone who buys a property here can have access to local schools. That will stimulate a lot of demand. So you see that there's still a lot of controls in place in China, even in the first tier cities, in property and the social infrastructure. And if you loosen them, there will be a proper rebound of domestic demand.
Yeah, mentioning about the school choice, it just reminds me of another city, the capital city of Inner Mongolia, which actually roll out this subsidies for childcare, including if a family have 3 children, then they can pretty much choose wherever their kids go to school. So it's also a big step for Chinese government to start subsidize the childcare and maybe elderly care as well.
Yeah, well, I think that's the right thing to do. I think that China has to learn from other countries that have been relatively successful in raising fertility, and obviously providing childcare services obviously gives more freedom to the working women of the household. And this is the kind of social services that will not only stimulate things like fertility, but also free up some resources for demand. So I think lots of lessons to be learned from those countries.
Do you think, what type of structural reform would be necessary in order to push China to make those changes? Like in the past, probably if one city government managed to invite more manufacturers to set shop in their place, then they actually get rewarded by tax and many other things. So what needs to be changed?
It is true that unless a few fundamental core challenges in the Chinese economy is not resolved over time, you're going to continue with that imbalance, whether China's economic weak or economically strong. And one is the relationship between local and central government. Local governments still have the burden of taking up the majority of the expenditure and the social and local economy, but it obviously relied in the past a lot on land sales and real estate as a source of revenue, and they have to ramp up a lot of debt to undertake those kind of responsibilities. But maybe the local government KPI should be changed from looking at GDP growth and investment to other things, maybe consumption, maybe jobs. You need to think these things through, but it has to be a more balanced approach. I think that another fundamental reform should be the redistribution system, taxation. I think still lots of people are not paying taxes, and direct income taxes is not very strong as a redistributionary force. A lot of the wealthy people are not really paying very high tax rates. It's actually in the end a bit regressive, given that the tax system relies a lot on the
global issue. Yeah,
it is a global issue, but China is not going to escape from that. But actually, Chinese taxation is more regressive than in many other advanced economies. But again, coming back to the social protection, social insurance, once people think that they have sustained rising wages and employment security, they're obviously going to be more free to spend, and that will boost some kind of consumption.
What about housing market? Are you still worried about the housing market?
The real estate downturn, I think, is really the primary factor causing China's cyclical economic downturn in the last few years, because the property sector really went beyond property, unlike in other countries, which all had their ups and downs in property, because it represented 2 core pillars of the economy: a shadow fiscal system and a shadow financial system. Something like 90% of local government debt is tied to real estate, and 70% of national debt is tied to real estate. And talking about this, coming back to this mayor economy, political economy model, there was an urbanization craze. They actually went from industrialization craze to urbanization craze because property became an even easier source of revenue. And so when that came down, it brought really down 2 pillars of the economy. So stabilizing real estate is absolutely crucial. In a good scenario, 5 to 7 years, stabilize, China can move on. Now, you're already seeing signs.
5 to 7 years, counting starting from 2022. So we're halfway.
In the good scenario. And that's coming from international data. A bad scenario would be 10 years. So I think if you look at the wealth effect, if Chinese people's wealth really dropped by 1/3, that has major consequences on consumption as well. So you really need to stabilize real estate to build that foundation for a stable a rebound. But also to mention that you're seeing signs of a transition already in the economic structure, a bit away from the real estate into broadly categorized as high-tech sector. So the government, coming back to the recent Congress, really is focusing on two things: consumption, so domestic demand, and productivity based on innovation.
Yeah, indeed. We have seen some green shoots in terms of housing stabilization and in terms of business confidence. I think DeepSeek disruption really has made a big difference.
Well, it was interesting because I was still debating foreign policy on peak China, the concept of peak China, and went from peak China to a few months later, DeepSeek moment, a major pendulum swing. And I keep on having to remind the Western audience that this is what always happens when you predict China like that, going from collapse, oops, no, second edition collapse, oops, no, third edition, then peak China, oh, and then DeepSeek, and suddenly everybody's interested in China again, right?
Yeah, nobody's talking about China is uninvestable.
No, not anymore. And that was the
More
major
clients
thing
are asking me about what's going on in China, what kind of the next DeepSeek moment will be.
Exactly. So this is what I've been trying to argue, that China's fundamentals are there. China's long-term potential is there. Just look at the people, the skills, the hard work, the scale, the market, the innovation. Yes, in the short term, confidence has been a major hindrance to the Chinese economic situation. But that's also very hard to rebuild, of course, but the fundamentals are there. It's a very different country from just the normal countries that fall into the middle income trap.
Yeah, indeed. I think nobody would expect all of a sudden tech companies and other type of companies are interested in increase the capex because of the DeepSeek, because of the potential of integrate AI into their production.
Actually, DeepSeek caught the world by surprise, but I don't think it caught China by that much of a surprise. Of course, Chinese people were thrilled because, hey, look what happened to these export controls and tech restrictions. China's still able to make these major achievements. Because if we live in China and observe the daily lives, innovation is happening here and there all the time. Breakthroughs, small and large, are at every level. So that's something to keep in mind, and it does permeate throughout the economy. The interesting thing is that I don't think this is head-on competition with the U.S., right? U.S. does these breakthroughs more systematic, model-based. The Chinese applications are really, really useful because ultimately the success of a technology and how much it actually impacts the economy depends on how much it's adopted, how accessible it is, and how much it permeates throughout society and everyday lives. And Chinese applications and Chinese technology are very much suited for that, because I think the approach of Chinese innovators start from trying to address a problem, solve a problem. And if we look at much of the developing world, it really isn't about access to advanced technologies that matters, but it's really about adoptability.
Very interesting. Since you mentioned about the U.S.-China rivalry, maybe we can end with that question. So do you think it's still possible for China and U.S. to reach a deal? What would the deal look like?
It's very interesting that Mr. Trump, or President Trump, his view of China seems to be evolving over time. We don't really know, but I think that in terms of competition, it's always going to be there. U.S. and Japan competition was quite ferocious in major tech sectors, but it really pushed U.S. to improve, U.S. to spend a lot more on its innovation system and reform its innovation system. And in turn, so did Japan. And as a result, we all have cheaper, better products. So for investors, at least from what I'm observing, if I were an investor, I think about being in both camps, if I can, to the extent possible, because there'll be some that will be successful in China and the U.S., and you just don't know. You don't know which one, because both have its respective advantages. But it's also, on a more sanguine note, it's also less likely that they're going to converge rather than move in parallel.
Thanks for sitting down with us and discuss all those interesting issues today. Hope to see you again in the near future. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Perspectives. Make sure you're subscribed to HSBC Global Viewpoint to stay connected